If you want to join me, we'll be studying this evening in the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 6 will be the bulk of our time, but if you can just turn to Daniel chapter 1, somewhere between Daniel chapter 1 and chapter 6, we'll be joining there together in just a few moments. Does it ever seem this way to you that other people seem to always make the right decisions and the right choices in life? And maybe it seems like they do so with relative ease. It seems like that they're always making the right, whether it's financial decisions or certainly more importantly, spiritual decisions, that they seem to always make the right choice. And again, seems kind of easy for them. And then maybe there's you or someone else who is on the other end of that spectrum that struggle with making the right choices. Maybe more often than not makes bad choices. And even when you make good choices, they didn't come easily. You had to really struggle at coming to that decision and then fulfilling that decision. I want to talk about that dilemma this evening as we continue our study of some interesting characters. Remember, our objective in this series of lessons is we're just going through, and I admit I'm selfish. I picked my favorite Bible characters, and we're studying one character per lesson this week. And then we're trying to see something in their life, something in their character that we can imitate and we can try to incorporate into our own lives, into our own character. And so, again, it's kind of a play on words with the word character. We're looking at these historical characters and their life and their examples of faith, but we're trying to build character within us. It is so important that we're not just doctrinally correct when it comes to the things that we teach and we practice. That's important. But it's just equally as important that we are the type of people that God wants us to be, that our lives are molded into the Word and into God's will for our life. And that's really been our objective this week, is to just see if we can grow in our character. And then this evening, in looking at the character of Daniel, we want to use him as an example and a lesson in how to make good choices. You could study a lot of facets of Daniel's life, and a lot of good lessons could be learned from Daniel's good, righteous example. But this evening, I want us to contemplate the fact that it seems like Daniel always made good choices. And we're going to see, how did he do that? Did he have some kind of secret weapon that we're not privy to? Or did he have something in his spiritual arsenal that we can incorporate into our spiritual arsenal? Like I said, we want to focus on probably the most famous of the chapters of the book of Daniel, one of the famous incidences in Daniel's life, and that's in Daniel chapter 6, when Daniel is famously thrown into the lion's den. But before we get to chapter 6, let's remind ourselves of kind of the background and the story of Daniel. The book of Daniel covers a lengthy period of time. It covers basically the whole 70 years of Babylonian captivity. And we're going to be impressed with that this is a lengthy study in the book of Daniel. But when we're introduced to Daniel in chapter 1, Daniel is a young man. We don't know how young. Some scholars speculate maybe he was a teenager or just a little above that. But we don't know exactly how old Daniel was. But we do know that he was a young man who was taken captive from Israel into Babylonian captivity. He, and remember the three friends of his, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they were put into position in this Babylonian kingdom. And basically, the closest thing that maybe we could think of it is the idea of they went to university, they went to college for a few years to study the things of the Babylonians. And Daniel excelled in that because he was blessed by God. But remember there in chapter 1, there was one thing in that participation in that study that Daniel refused to engage in, and that is that he would not eat or drink the king's food. Again, we're not sure what was wrong with the king's food and drink. Maybe it didn't line up with the Jewish dietary restrictions. There may have been other reasons that Daniel just felt like from a spiritual standpoint that he just couldn't engage in that. And so he, against the advice of his superiors, he just refuses to do that, but God blessed him nonetheless. And you remember, if you were with us earlier this week, we talked about the young man Joseph. And in a lot of ways, Daniel and Joseph kind of mirror each other. Their stories start when they're young men. They're taken captive when they're young men. And dreams play heavily in their story. And that is certainly the case with Daniel. Daniel interprets some dreams of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, and that brings him greater favor in the eyes not just of God, but of his fellow man and of the king. Well, time rocks on in Daniel, and by the time we get to Daniel chapter 6, and we don't often maybe think about it this way, by the time we get to Daniel chapter 6, Daniel's not a young man anymore. If you can remember maybe pictures from Bible class when you're a little kid, they may have been pictures of a young man in the lion's den. Well, that simply wasn't the case. About 70 years has transpired from chapter 1 to chapter 6, and so he is most likely in his 80s, if not even older than that, when we get to Daniel chapter 6. But again, a decision has to be made. A choice has to be taken by Daniel. He's under new leadership now. We could kind of jokingly call him a two-time loser. He was taken captive as an Israelite and then incorporated into the Babylonian kingdom and then was taken captive as a Babylonian by the Medo-Persians. And as we get to chapter 6, it's a different king and a different kingdom. A man by the name of Darius is on the throne. And as God has blessed Daniel, he has risen to the top. There's 120 leaders who have been appointed in the Medo-Persian Empire, and above them just 3 men of great position and honor. And Daniel is one of those. And unfortunately, a dark part of human nature is oftentimes when somebody else does good, we become jealous and hateful of that person. And that's exactly what happened in Daniel's case. And so some of those other rulers conspired against Daniel. And they went to Darius and kind of buttered up Darius and says, Darius, why don't you make a ruling, an edict, that if anybody petitions any other god or any other man within the next 30 days, that he'll be punished. He'll be punished by throwing him into the lion's den, because we only want to petition you, Darius, they said. And so Darius, unaware of their scheming, agrees and puts that law into effect. And what's Daniel going to do? What's praying Daniel going to do? Prayer has been outlawed for at least 30 days. Now, when we think about making choices, we could think about Daniel. What were Daniel's choices? Could Daniel have rationalized that I just won't pray for 30 days? And at the end of 30 days, I'll make up for it. You know, sometimes we do that if we're out of town and we don't lay by and store on the first day of the week. Well, when I get back off of vacation, I'll put in 2 checks on Sunday. I'll just make up for that Sunday I was gone. And so maybe Daniel could have rationalized in his mind, I'll do that. I'll take 30 days off from praying, but when that law is nullified and out of effect, I'll just double up on my prayers. I'll pray twice as much for the next 30 days and make up for it, and God will understand that. He could have taken that choice. You know, another choice I think Daniel could have tried to take at least is he could have prayed in private. Do you remember that story? That prayer has been outlawed just in a single attempt to get Daniel in trouble. And then the story says when Daniel hears that that law is in effect, it says that he goes home and he flings open the windows and prays to God. Have you ever wondered why he did that? Why he didn't close the windows? In my study of the Old Testament, I don't see any law of God that said you had to pray with the windows open. There's no principle that says God can't hear you if the doors are closed and the shades are drawn. We know that's certainly not the case. And so why didn't Daniel just try to sneak around and pray in private? I don't know the answer to that. The text really doesn't tell us that. But if I were to speculate, it seems to me that Daniel knew what they were up to. That this law had Daniel's name written on it. They're just trying to get Daniel in trouble, like they said. The only way we can get him in trouble is in regard to his God. And so it seems to me there's some backboned defiance in Daniel. That he says, okay, you're going to get me in trouble worshiping my God? Then let's just get it over with. and here it is. I'm praying, and I'm not going to hide it. And that's the choice that he made, but it was a choice that could have cost him his life. He is thrown into that lion's den, a gruesome way to die. And so let's think about Daniel. Now, obviously, there in Daniel chapter 6, it's spoiler alert if you hadn't read this story or seen the movie, that Daniel does make the right choice. He prays to God. He is thrown into that lion's den, but God protects him, as he had protected his 3 friends in that fiery furnace years earlier. But Daniel didn't know that. He didn't know for certain that God was going to protect him. He may have thought that his act of defiance in praying to God was indeed going to brutally cost him his life. But yet Daniel made the right choice anyway. And I want to talk about how he could make the right choice and see if it can help us in incorporating those decision makings into our life. There's at least 3 lessons that I think we're going to observe tonight in the idea of making good choices from the example of Daniel. Let's just start here and just admit that sometimes, many times, maybe we could say most times, good choices are difficult to make. Let's not sugarcoat it. This wasn't an easy decision for Daniel. It's not like that Daniel knew what we knew and that he was going to be protected. I believe all indications are that Daniel had a pretty good idea that he would be shredded by those lions. But he made that choice anyway. And you know, Daniel's whole life is an illustration of that. Daniel always faced difficult choices. In chapter 1, when he was faced with the idea of compromising his standards and his spiritual integrity to eat and to drink the things on the king's table, he made what had to be a difficult decision. Surrounded by peer pressure, surrounded by the threat again of maybe his own life being taken. He makes the choice to choose 3 good godly companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as his closest comrades and friends. He makes the choice to stand up and say, God can determine the meaning of the dreams that Nebuchadnezzar was having. And then finally, he makes this difficult choice. Over and over again, Daniel's life was a life of choices, and it was a life of difficult choices. And I want us to emphasize that, and the reason I'm emphasizing it is for a couple reasons. Number one is, don't ever think that those men and women in the Bible who just stand out as great men and women of faith, that they had it somehow easier than you do. Or, secondly, that they had something genetic within them, some kind of almost like superpower, that they had this spiritual understanding, this kind of faith, this kind of integrity that's just unknown to you and I. We're just not those superheroes like those biblical characters are. Neither of those things are the case. They were flesh and blood just like you and I. These choices were just as difficult as the choices that we have to make to live a good, godly life. And they didn't have anything other than their faith. They didn't have anything at their disposal that's not at your disposal to be able to make those good choices. But what they did have, and what Daniel had on these occasions, is a component that we talked about last night in our study of Uriah. And that is, he had courage. It takes courage to make those difficult choices. We talked about bravery last night, courage tonight. And so let's define courage. What is courage? And let's understand this. This is not what courage is. Courage is not the absence of fear. You know what the absence of fear is? Craziness is what that is. It's not the absence of fear. It's not that Daniel didn't have a fear of lions. He didn't have a fear of dying a horrendous death. Courage, rather than being the absence of fear, courage is doing what's right in the face of fear. Daniel's knees shook just like yours do. He worried and fretted over whether he was making the right decision, just like you do. But somewhere deep down inside, Daniel made the decision that I'm going to do what's right, no matter what. And I want us to have a little bit of that defiance that Daniel had. When he went home and flung those windows open and said, all right, you're going to catch me praying, then let's just get it over with. I pray in my hour of temptation, I have that backbone. When I'm pressured to hide my faith and to maybe to be ashamed of my belief in God and Christianity and of the God of the creation, that if I ever think about shrinking back and doubling back, that I'll remember Daniel and I'll just fling my windows open and say, let's get it over with. Because I'm going to serve God. Decisions, good decisions, are often difficult. But another lesson that we learn from Daniel, and maybe this is the most valuable one that we'll observe tonight, is Daniel forever illustrates to us that making good choices is often the result of having made good choices. When we get to Daniel chapter 6, like I said, about 70 years have transpired between chapter 1 and chapter 6. And if this was a Bible class and we had started in Daniel 1 verse 1 and studied through week by week and found ourselves in chapter 6, we would make this point, that in these 70 years and this choice, maybe the most difficult choice that Daniel's ever going to make, am I going to stand up on the side of God and right, or am I going to hide in fear to save my neck? That if we were reading through this and studying through this for the first time, we would pause and I would say, don't read ahead. What do you think Daniel's going to do? Do you think he's going to shrink back and cower away, or is he going to stand up and face that sentence of death? And I think we'd probably all, if we'd studied the first 5 chapters, we'd say, I know what he's going to do, because of what he did in chapter 1 and of how he lived in chapter 2 and how he stood up in the face of death in chapter 4. And do you get the point? That those early decisions that he made it such that he could make these bigger decisions later in life. Daniel lived out the principle that we need to understand, that making good decisions can begin the ball rolling or the dominoes falling to the next good decision and the next good decision. Now, the story we looked at last night of David and Bathsheba shows us that the opposite is also true. Making bad decisions can create incentive and motivation to make more bad decisions. Isn't that kind of what David did? One bad decision led to another bad decision, to an even worse decision, to a cataclysmic, horribly bad decision. And so, practice. Look with me, hold your finger there in the book of Daniel and go with me to the New Testament in the book of Luke. In Luke chapter 16 and in verse 10, after telling this parable, Jesus makes this point, this conclusion in Luke chapter 16 and verse 10. And let's see how that fits in to this principle that making good choices starts with making other good choices. Look what Jesus says, Luke 16, verse 10. He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. And he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Isn't that kind of what is personified in Daniel? That Daniel made good decision after good decision after good decision. And so when we get to chapter 6, we don't have to wonder, is he going to make the right choice now? His whole life has been preparing him for this moment. And my fear for myself and for my fellow Christians in the 21st century is that when we find ourselves on the battlefield of decision, when maybe one of the most crucial spiritual decisions are facing us, that we've done very little to prepare for that moment. I hope that's not the case. I hope that we can say that these maybe seemingly trivial decisions and choices I've been making, if they've been the right ones, they serve valuable foundation for being able to make the right choice. Let me see if I can illustrate this way. And I think this is a foundational principle taught in Scripture that we need to understand, this idea of getting into the practice of doing what's right. When our kids were little, our kids are grown and out of the house now, but when our kids were little, I can remember going to the store with them. Sometime my wife and I would take the two little ones and we'd go to the store, and kids don't change. What do they want when they go to the store? They want something off those shelves. They can find something. I don't care if you're at the drugstore, the grocery store, or at Walmart. They can find something they want. And our kids would oftentimes say, oh, I want that, I want that. And we started very early on making a practice of telling them no. Now, sometimes we told them no because we couldn't afford it. We barely got enough money to get the groceries. We don't have money for toys. Sometimes we would say no because you've already got enough junk at home. You don't need something else cluttering up the toy box. But we made the conscious decision that sometimes we would tell them no just for the fun of it. No, but we would tell them no just to set them up that sometimes you need to hear no. Nothing wrong with that toy. In fact, Dad kind of like to play with that when you go to bed at night. But we need to tell you no right now because you're not always going to get something. Isn't that a kind of a good principle to learn in life? I think there's a biblical precedent for that. The idea of fasting taught those Israelites and even those first century Christians, and maybe could teach us 21st century Christians, that sometimes you're going to have to do without. Sometimes you're going to have to suffer. And you need to be prepared for that. And I'm going to tell you, you go out into the wild today, and I'm not casting aspersions certainly on the young people that are here tonight. I know that you're the exception to the rule. But you go out into the wild today and encounter young people, and you find a whole lot of young people, a whole lot of young adults now, whose mom and dad never told them no. And you employers are reaping the benefits of that, aren't you? And I think that's the principle we see here. Daniel made good choices in chapter 1, good choices in chapter 2, some good choices in chapter 4. And so when we get to chapter 6 and the decision, the choice above all choices, Daniel's ready. In fact, we're sitting back watching this being played out on the stage, and we're saying, Daniel, you got this. You've been preparing this for your whole life. And so give some thought to the choices that you make, even the small choices. Do I stay home on Wednesday night, or do I go to Bible class? Do I make an excuse, or do I show up some evening in the gospel meeting? It may seem like small choices, but they're building the foundation. Because one day, like Daniel, your whole faith is going to be on the line. And the choice you make that day will be largely determined by those earlier choices. And so choices are difficult to make. Making good choices, start with making good choices. Build that momentum today. But then the last point that we can see in the life of Daniel, and the example of Daniel and the decisions and choices that he made, is that making good choices are found on the side of God. Not only did Daniel just make a series of good choices in his life, those weren't random and those weren't coincidental. I think it's obvious if you study the life of Daniel and all of these men and women of faith that we're talking about this week, that you realize that they made those choices because they made the big choice to serve God. Do you remember the old bus advertisement from years ago when they were encouraging you to take the bus and they said, leave the driving to us? That's kind of the principle of Christianity, isn't it? That we leave the driving to God. That we make the big decision that I'm going to be a child of God and everything that's involved in that. And Jesus did not hide from us that that was sometimes going to be a difficult and a costly choice to make. But you make that choice, eyes wide open, that I'm going to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, and I'm going to take everything that goes with that decision. And in essence, once you make that decision, every other decision has been made for you. Every other choice has already been taken. Because I'm going to do what God would have me to do. One last New Testament passage. Go with me to the book of James. James chapter 1. James makes a subtle point in James chapter 1 that I think is so crucial for us when it comes to the idea of making choices. James chapter 1, let's look at verse 12. James 1 verse 12, the Holy Spirit says, blessed is the man who endures temptation. Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he'll receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those that love him. I think James is forcing us to connect some dots in chapter 1 verse 12. Notice what he says. He says, if you endure temptation, you're going to receive a crown of life. But then he says that crown of life has actually already been promised to somebody else. It's been promised to those that love the Lord. And so the question is, James, who gets the crown of life? Does the fellow who endures temptation, does he get the crown of life? Or does the person who loves the Lord get the crown of life? You've said it goes to... And I think what the Holy Spirit is trying to get us to see is that those are the same people. The one who endures temptation is the one who loves the Lord. And this may be somewhat of an oversimplification and maybe somewhat depressing of those times in which we've given in to temptation and failed when we ought to stand up and make the right choice. But it seems to me that the principle the Holy Spirit is laying down in James chapter 1 and verse 12, and that is that this doing right, resisting temptation, just boils down to a choice. And the choice is in that moment of decision, what or who do I love more? Do I love that passing pleasure of sin? Or do I love God more? And that's a scary thought. That it's a choice. And if I've chosen God, and again, my fear, maybe I'm a pessimist, but I don't think so. But my fear is that too many who wear the name Christian either have not fully made that choice or haven't given enough thought to the choice that they made. That I chose to love God. And so now every other decision is going to be filtered through that choice. Is my doing this behavior demonstrate my love to God? Or is it just because I want that instant gratification that I might gain through that moment of sin? I think it's apparent that Daniel made the big choice to serve God, fully aware of what that meant. And that at every juncture in his life, when he was faced with a decision, sometimes very difficult choices to be made, that he always went back to the first decision, and that was, I'm going to serve God. And I know this may sound trite and oversimplified, but child of God, you'll find it so much easier to do what's right, so much easier to live the Christian life if you'll make that big decision to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. And so I want to challenge you here tonight that if you haven't made that decision, would you make it right now? Eyes wide open as to what that decision means. And to those of you who have already made that decision and put on Christ in baptism at some other point in your life, I want you sometime this week to pause and think about that decision. Did you really fully make that decision? And have you been living in that decision? And if not, rededicate yourself to that choice. Don't make it quickly. Don't make it rashly in the spur of the moment. You sit down in prayer to your Father and you contemplate, have I really, really made the choice to give my life to Christ? And if you'll do that, I think you'll be amazed at the burden that's lifted off of your heart, and you'll be amazed at how much easier it is to make the right choices in your service to God. Can we help you to be a Daniel, to make those right choices and those right decisions tonight? If we can, let it be known as together we stand and as we sing.